Welcome back to another episode of Hello CISO, where we talk to CISOs and IT leaders. Today, I would like to talk about some common sense security practices, and their all too common counterparts, the bullshit ones. Let's dive in. If we're going to talk about common sense security, we have to talk about the common sense part first because it doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Common sense isn't so much an absolute truth as it is a product of the environment. And very often this is an environment that we're so far embedded in, it's actually very hard to step back and have a look at it objectively. This is why outsiders and newcomers often have such a clear view of an organisation. They haven't been ingrained into all of the practices that have been followed for years, and they get to take a look at that environment with a clear set of eyes. So today, I'd like to take a clear-eyed approach to common sense in the security world. And then we'll take a look at the much harder piece, affecting real change. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. We'll take two companies, Company A and Company B. Now, Company A has a 100-page long security policy. Company B has a 10-page long security policy. So on the surface of it, it might feel like Company A's policy is much more robust. But we have to ask ourselves, what are those 100 pages actually doing? What real-world difference do they make? Because volume alone is not what we're looking for here. We want policies of substance that will actually make a positive difference to the environment. For many people, it would be intuitive that a longer policy would be more robust. If you had, say, 100 people defending a castle, that's better than 5 people, right? But the trick is, what is in those pages? How practical is it? And this is where we need to apply some common sense to the equation. For example, that 100-page policy versus the 5-page policy. How much harder is it going to be for people to actually comply with the former? Look, it might have a lot of stuff in it, and some of it might actually be good, but compliance is going to be much harder than the document which is only 5 pages long. And the problem here is that we have humans involved, and we need to think about how do we make things like security policies consumable by humans such that they can make a real difference in the organisation. If you're a CISO or an IT manager, you're probably already quite aware of this. In fact, you might have already spent a great deal of your time trying to simplify policies, particularly if you've come into an organisation with an incumbent set of processes. And perhaps it's you with the fresh eyes that can see things from the perspective that only an outsider can. In many, if not most cases, your efforts to simplify security policies may have been troublesome. You might have gotten pushback. And very often this is due to what we refer to as CYA, or cover your ass. Now, CYA often involves prioritising the company's reputation over the company's security posture. And very often that actually weakens the posture, because you're now left dealing with a box-ticking exercise that very often doesn't really make much difference at all. This is how we end up with 100-page security policies. It is literally covering the organisation's, well, you know what it's covering. Now, this exercise doesn't necessarily make any positive improvement to the environment whatsoever. But I've seen many cases myself in the past where the organisation has been able to say, well, we ticked all the boxes, we're good to go. Does that actually make the security posture better? Very often not, but hey, we did check a lot of boxes. When companies start to focus on massive long security policies, that begins to become the norm, and everyone sees it as normal. And because they see it as normal, that in itself almost becomes common sense, when really it's quite the opposite. A great example of this is how we end up with things like mandatory password rotation policies. Now, if you've been watching this series, you'll know that that's not really something that provides us with any benefit outside a few very specific circumstances. But when there's a policy and a checkbox that says, yes, passwords have been rotated on a regular basis, that satisfies the requirement, but it doesn't really give us anything of a tangible value in terms of security. Yet somehow, mandated password rotation policies are still very, very common. Why? Because it gives the appearance of security. Doesn't actually add any security, but it does give the appearance of it. But this is also a great example of how things change over time, because there was a time when things like mandated password rotation made a lot more sense. So for example, in years gone by, we had much less transport layer security. There were many more places that a password could have been intercepted than what there are today, where we have almost ubiquitous encryption on the network. So maybe that did make sense a decade ago, possibly even 2 decades ago when that policy was written. But it is different today. And very often these policies just accumulate requirements over time. And you end up with a great big stack of things which made sense at different points in time, but really just don't work well today. So maybe parts of your policy were common sense at one time. But the environment changes and the policies need to change with it. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a whole bunch of stuff in there which is no longer common sense at all. Here's a tip for when you face opposition to cut unnecessary requirements out of security policies. Appeal to a higher power. Let me give you an example of that, and let's take that mandated password rotation requirement which I mentioned just before. Now, NIST has some great guidance on why that really doesn't make sense today. NIST are the higher power. Go and pull the NIST documents and show that to the folks who are not keen on you making that change. And while you're there, NIST has some other great guidelines as well. Things like no longer mandating arbitrary password complexity criteria, which might have been common sense in many years gone by, but is now actively discouraged. Yet that is still something which is in many security policies, and it's not there for a reason that makes sense anymore. These days, I think everyone knows that mandated password rotation just doesn't make sense. So rather than just saying, hey, let's take that out, defer back to that higher power, such as NIST in this case. All the CYA apologists are really looking for is a way to shift the blame if something goes wrong. So let them point the finger at NIST, because that's the higher power that's setting common sense standards. All of this, of course, does go well beyond password. You could apply it to telecommuting policies or confidentiality policies, and basically everything else that falls under the umbrella of security. As CISOs and IT leaders, we need to take every little gain we can get, even if that gain means overcoming internal opposition in order to get common sense security at the forefront. You might have come here today hoping for a list of policies, things you can go away and implement straight away. And if that's the case, well, sound off in the comments and we can try and pick that up in a future episode. But I want to caution against this practice of thinking that more is better. The 100-page security policy, for example, it's so often just a box-ticking exercise. Tick this box and that bit's done, and that box and that bit's done. But does it make a difference? Does it actually move the organisation forward in some practical, tangible way? We've got to remember that ultimately these policies are for humans. And one of the problems that we all have as humans is security fatigue. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, with everything that goes into these policy documents, is it actually making a positive difference, or is it just a drain on our soul and it's not actually doing anything practical and useful for the organisation? Lastly, remember that all of this needs to work for humans. More and more, IT isn't just about the technology we use or the policies we write. It's about the people and the way the people interact with our technology and our policies. And we need to keep that human interface always at the forefront of our minds. That is the common sense approach to security. If you've enjoyed this video as part of the Hello CISO series, then please give it a like and subscribe to the 1Password YouTube channel for more videos like this.